Garfield Park in Chicago, and it's called Lucy Flower Career Academy. That's the name it was called a few years ago. And if you had walked into the school 15 years ago, you might see a room past the metal detectors that looks like this. It's difficult to make out, but what you can see is school paraphernalia, white walls, something very plain. This was in the entrance foyer of the school. If you'd walked in there 50 years ago, this is what you would see. And that's what conservators from the Chicago Conservation Society saw when they walked into the school. As they began to dig beneath the layers of this paint, they found a mural. What they found, covering all the walls of this entrance foyer, was Edward Millman's Outstanding American Woman, painted in 1938 and 1940. It is a true fresco. Fresco in the sense of the Mexican muralists used fresco, Michelangelo used fresco, and it covered the wall. To give you a sense of size that you can't get here, all of these figures are over life size. So this monumental fresco adorned the walls of the school. And on this fresco, the artist Edward Millman depicted a series of well-known American women. In the corner, the school's namesake, Lucy Flower, Frances Perkins, Grace Abbott. On this wall, Harriet Beecher Stowe and Harriet Tubman, Clara Barton, and Susan B. Emily. This school, this mural, was very well received by the principal, by the students, but it was not well received by everyone. And here's some details for you to look at. There's one wall, and this is the other wall. And we'll look at it a little more closely in a moment. 18 months after it was completed, it was covered with white paint. The Board of Education in Chicago covered this with white paint, saying, Millman's mural is, quote, lacking in the spirit we should have in the public school to inspire young American womanhood. And anyone looking at the mural will get the impression they are stressing poverty and the failure of democracy to uplift its people, unquote. Chicago, that's from the quote from Chicago Board of Education, 1941. And the mural was covered with white paint. It was believed to be destroyed until the late 1990s when conservators found it again. Millman's mural, however, is not singular. It is one of 500 historic murals placed in Chicago public schools between 1904 and 1941. 500 murals that we know of. They're made up of over 2,000 mural panels. And I want to give you a little selection of some of these murals. In auditoriums like this, we see murals that adorn the perimeter of these spaces. Hallways also were covered with other frescoes. The doorways, the lunettes over doorways to auditoriums and libraries. And indeed, there were some well-known pieces as well. This is a mural. It's a little bit odd because there's a door hanging in there. But by Marion Mahoney Griffin. A name that some of you may know, but some of you might not know. But she's best known for actually developing the camera plan. She was the first licensed female architect in the United States. She was also Frank Lloyd Wright's chief draftsperson. And she created this mural in the Chicago Public School. We would also see other works by this artist who studied with Diego Rivera and Biciberos in Mexico. Was one of the, he was trained by the Mexican muralists in that revolutionary period, and he came to Chicago to paint murals in all the schools. We also have elements such as this, which is a kindergarten, which has murals of the months of the year set into a prairie-style kindergarten with Jens Jensen landscaping outside of the kindergarten. What you can't tell right now is actually these murals rotate. There are 12 months of the year, and they are rotated seasonally. And this is in a Chicago grammar school as well as examples such as this, which is known as contemporary Chicago by an artist who is known as the Picasso of Chicago. And this is in a hallway of a public school. Most of the murals occur in liminal spaces, actually not in classrooms, as Julia was just talking about, but in the spaces between classrooms, hallways, auditoriums, as we're seeing here, libraries. as inferior, because perhaps if they're meant for a school, the audience is not schooled enough to appreciate the art. Moreover, schools are not thought of as places of artistic or architectural innovation. They're actually thought of as less than a museum, less than a church in studying this. Well, we're shifting that attention. We're shifting and focusing now on school art as we see with this conference and the literature happening in recent years. What I'd like to do today is take another look at the school art collection in Chicago. What I'd like to do is give you a brief overview of the history of the early 20th century. Then I'd like to focus on Millman's mural as an example of the competing agendas that shaped school murals during this time period. I also want to move us away from looking at murals too narrowly. As Kathy said at the beginning of the day, art historians tend to look at these murals either in regards to the artist's production, in regards to major art movements in the world, or educational historians look at it as part of education. I want to look at it as a complex constellation, one that takes into account art, artist, educational politics, and the fact that the school decoration movement was a unique movement, both in the history of art and the history of education. So we want to understand it in that complex way, and we're going to try and do that by focusing on this Millman and the censorship, and see what does it mean to look at these murals in this complex agenda. And then finally, I want to look a little bit at how these murals are used in contemporary society, and then I'll speak to my work in the museums in Chicago. It's a big plan for not a lot of time, so bear with me as I give you whiplash in the history of art. The first phase of mural decoration actually occurred in the early 20th century. Many people who study the school mural movement often divide school murals into two periods, the Progressive era and the New Deal era during the Great Depression. What I have seen is actually the 20th century is divided into three different periods. The school mural movement in Chicago began with this mural. It's now destroyed. It shows the arts and the humanities painted by Frederick Clay Bartlett, and it was placed in Chicago Public School. You can't gauge very much from these black and white photos, but descriptions of the time describe these works as classical scenes, Arcadian landscapes, idyllic blue skies and beautiful seas that contrasted with soot-covered faces of students. Schools packed with 600 students with one wash basin. The murals were put there actually to give an ideal vision of another life. These were commissioned by the Chicago Women's Club, and the school decoration movement began actually under the auspices of reformist women's clubs in Chicago at the turn of the century. And this, I think, is a very important piece of the story, and part of the reason this is called Outstanding American Women. Not just for Millman's mural, but for the women who started this program in the early 20th century. The key club responsible for school decoration in Chicago was actually the Public School Art Society, which grew out of Hull House, a settlement house in Chicago. And Jane Addams ran Hull House, and her colleague was Ellen Gates Starr. Ellen Gates Starr came to England, to Manchester, visited schools that she saw that were decorated, and she believed that she needed to take that information back to Chicago. So she started the Public School Art Society, and this is an example of a public school at the turn of the century. Decorated, you see here, neatly on throughout you see painting, plants. Schools were decorated almost like small satellite museums. We see here's the school, and this is the Art Institute of Chicago at the same time. School decoration began with small classroom casts and reproductions, and the idea really was to create these satellite museums in outlying neighborhoods. The women from these women's clubs, and here's one woman here, actually also became docents in the school. They worked in the schools teaching, this is the Shaw Memorial and other prints, students, the necessity of art and meaning of art. This was very, very important at this time, because at the very time that these schools are being decorated, the Board of Education has decided it's a no fads, no frills curriculum, meaning no art, no music, no humanities, because, as the Board of Education declared at this time, no bricklayer needs Shakespeare. And they took anything that was not useful suffrage through school decoration. Eventually, their attention went to murals. And this is an example of a mural. The money that was spent on these murals was equivalent to the salary for a principal at this time. So no expense was spared. Murals about this size as well. It actually renders this liminal space into a de facto factory. Students who were left there during the day in what was known as the platoon system, where they would not actually be going to class all day, but would be shifted in this in-between time into auditoriums, would be in this de facto factory for most of the day. It is at this time, too, that we see a switch in mural painting. Under government patronage during the 1930s, we see artists and artworks changing significantly in the schools. Government patronage allowed artists actually a little more freedom. They're coming out untethered from the Board of Education, from administrators. But they're also local artists in this case. Many artists who were raised in the very public schools that we've talked about in the past and now feed for them. Some of the murals are very typical of Depression-era murals, and this is Lucille Ward's History of Chicago. It's a narrative of the history of Chicago from its founding, through the fire, and through the present day. It's an onward and upward narrative, a teleological narrative that shows we will rise out of this Great Depression once again. It's very positive, it's very typical of the New Deal artwork of that time period. And other artworks are actually a little more left-leaning. There was that possibility here, this is again Edgar Britton, who trained at United States, who start to work in line with some of the unions, trade unions, labor unions, but also artists' unions. And they see mural painting as a way to radicalize a message, to actually change American scene painting. It's out of this that Millman's mural grows. And I want to turn our attention now to outstanding American women, to focus a little bit on really what made this work so controversial at that time. Again, this is Lucy Flower taken from High School. And in 1937, it was really at the center of a lot of controversy over vocational education. Even though it became known as Lucy Flower Career Academy, it was known as the Vocational Academy in the early 20th century. This is a cartoon from 1937 when the mural was commissioned, and it says, "No man can serve two masters." And here's education, an allegorical figure of education, and a student who holds two pieces of paper. One says instructions from the Board of Education, and the other orders from labor unions. One or the other, which? I think this cartoon really summarizes the debates that are occurring at this time and throughout the early 20th century over vocational education. They were seen from the point of view of the Board of Education as the most democratic form of education. According to the Board of Education, vocational education allowed students from working class backgrounds to achieve their highest work potential. And therefore, these vocational spaces were transitional spaces for the students. Labor unions decried this practice as a bias against immigrant and working class children. And they really saw vocational education as funneling working class students into work life and treating them as workers to be rather than students. So labor unions at this time, including the teachers union, really favored more palatable federal standards, abolishing IQ tests, moving away from giving students, not as we say, internships, but having them work during school time. Lucy Flower was at the center of this controversy because at this time it was the only all-girls integrated vocational academy in Chicago. It was founded during the Progressive Era, named by a woman named Ella Clyde Young, and named for another Progressive Era reformer named Lucy Flower. And when it was first founded, it was considered a place where young women could receive both academic education, but also preparation for work life as seamstresses, service workers, and garment workers. By the time Millman was commissioned, the curriculum at Flower had really changed. It had become a very tracked system. African American students and immigrant students were tracked into garment and service work, and white students at the school were actually into a more academic subject. I had the privilege of looking through yearbooks and also journals from students of this school while I was researching, and particularly the African American students in the late 30s comment on how excluded they were from many of the elements of the school. Millman, and this is a picture of him from the late 1930s, was a very well-known artist at this time. He had actually completed several post office murals. He too used to drive from Chicago to Mexico to work with Rivera. That's how he learned fresco. He chose fresco technique because he said, if you paint a mural, you have to be a part of the school. You have to be a part of the community. And he wanted to spend 2 years knowing the students at Lucy Flower Technical High School. He was actually also the head of the Chicago Arts Student, a left-wing organization in Chicago that embraced mural painting to produce a social message. Let's take a closer look at this mural here. Again, this is the two walls. It's hard to gauge this in this image, but what we see are women such as Lucy Flower, overseeing the education of a young woman, Clara Barton, comforting the wounded on the battlefield, and this is actually Ellen Gates Starr, the founder of the Public School Art Society, and Jane Addams, overseeing the caring of people in tenements. Millman had studied Chicago history, had actually grown up in a school that had a progressive era mural. The murals, the women here, are all typified, they're hard to tell apart, but there's a unity that's created from this earth tone palette, the pyramidal structure of the figures, the heavy faces and the heavy hands. The women in this mural were actually pretty much the same mural women that were portrayed in this 1933 mural from the Century of Progress World's Fair. By Hildred Meyer, Millman knew this mural. This was very positively received. And actually, if you remember the quote, the Board of Education praised Millman's choice of women. It was the spirit of the mural they decried. It was the failure to uplift, the message about democracy that came out in the mural that they did not like. Let's look at what encouraged this reading. Again, these are two ads from Lucy Flower. An early ad working for the degree of laundress when it was first created. And here are two pictures of Flower's classes in the late 1930s. This is a service class, and this is a textile class. This is an image of young students working side by side. It's a publicity photo. You see an integrated class. They're in neat rows, and it looks like a very genteel, harmonious activity. This was something that Millman would have encountered while working at flower painting. But his image of garment workers is quite different. This is a triad of figures on one of the walls of the school. And what you see is an older woman working at the sewing machine, a younger woman sewing by hand barefoot, and a gaunt figure hunched over an ironing board. This image is much more immiserated and an image of garment workers than this image here. It actually connotes the oppressive working conditions of the industry. This comes out even more when you see it next to this figure here. The three garment workers are placed next to the image of Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins was appointed Secretary of Labor in 1933, and she was known for really ameliorating the rights of miners. But her work got its start in the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which some of you may know was a key moment in the garment working industry in the United States and initiated a lot of reform, which Frances Perkins was responsible for. When we see Perkins here stands helping the miner's family, but also looking back at the garment workers. It implies the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, the garment workers' reform, and it also aligns Millman with a greater cause at this time. Images of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and garment workers' strikes were common in our work in the 1930s. And this is a print by Ida Abelman, and it's called My Father Reminisces, and it's about the garment industry. Prints like this were actually commissioned by unions and placed in union headquarters to draw attention to worker reform, to align artists with union causes, and to educate workers. Many of the union started to set up educational forces in union headquarters themselves using art. Millman's work aligns with this strategy. Another element that is very common in this mural, and that is actually the most recurrent motif, is the image of reading. Figures read here, Lucy Flower and Grace Sabbath in this point with the image of Jane Addams, as well as in these areas. Now, the image of reading is not a very atypical theme for school murals. And because the school actually used this space for reading, it doesn't seem atypical. Here, this gives you an idea of scale as well. Oh, sorry, I'm running out of time. I feel like I've received an Oscar and I have to wrap up. School murals are actually are right here. Sometimes show children reading, but these are not reading in the confines of schools. Actually, reading in oppressive conditions. You see immigrants reading outside, with Grace Abbott teaching other students to read. And then in this image, most importantly, we see a very key use of reading. Harriet Beecher Stowe and Harriet Tubman are conflated together. This is notable because it's an African American woman, but also because it represents a literary scene. This is a scene from Uncle Tom's Cabin, where Eva St. Clair is teaching Uncle Tom to read. And by conflating these images, and we see slaves picking cotton to the left, he makes the argument for the conflation of reading, learning, emancipation. This is a key argument in school that African American girls learning alongside of white girls at the same time. It contradicts more stereotypical images of African Americans in other schools, and actually aligns with radical African American imagery of this time. This is Charles White's History of the Negro, where we see Harriet Beecher Stowe and Sojourner Truth leading emancipation. The work itself, too, seems to kind of contradict some of this teleological narrative that we see in other mural murals. Rather than onward and upward, Millman's narrative actually goes in a circle. It's unresolved. It's ongoing. It swells up and down. The movement around the room has no beginning or end. In a way, we just see this cycle continuing and continuing. The room itself was used as a social room, which was designated, actually built during the mechanical era. And the principal said, a social room in which all relationships in the school are enacted, and all the relationships should be democratic. Well, he really lays bare the inequalities in the school, the inequalities of vocational education by pointing to the garment workers, by showing reading that occurs outside the confines of the school, by giving this unresolved narrative. Millman was not there when this mural was painted over, but some of his artist friends actually commented on it. One artist said, this is typical of the totalitarian methods of the Board of Education, and another example of their blitz technique. Such acts are comparable to Hitler's burning of the books, another artist said. These are very insightful comments, because by likening the Board of Education to a fascist regime, these artists are actually putting democracy, the debate over democracy and education, at the heart of these educational arguments. What constitutes an equal education? How do we use art in this regard? These are questions that are still relevant to us today. And I very briefly just want to talk about how the restoration and reintegration of these murals lives in Chicago. I'm really astounded by the stories I've heard today because, in fact, they're very similar to the stories in Chicago. It was the teachers, the citizens, the students, not the Board of Education, who initiated the reintegration of murals and the discovery of murals. They led the charge to bring murals like this back to schools such as Lucy Flower. I was part of a program called Chicago, the City and Art, which created a curriculum based on these murals. So we see murals like Mary Mahoney's Griffin's mural turned into a play that resuscitated the career of Mary Mahoney Griffin and actually turned into t-shirts made by the students. Other images with controversial images of race became touchstones for dialogues on American writing and the issue of race in America. I went back to my PhD largely because of one story, and I'll end with this story. When I first went into a public school and I started to work with school teachers, making sure that they had no extras, as we've heard, no fads, no frills. I had to convince students and teachers that this was important. And I had to work with one school in particular. When I went into the school, one teacher pointed to a student and said, "That's Kyle, don't expect much from him." And my heart broke. They said he doesn't do well, he doesn't have any friends. And over the course of a year of working with this student, it was through the art that we were learning from, the working with these murals, that he actually rose. Other students came to him and started to ask him for help. On the final exhibition we had at the Art Institute of Chicago, it was Kyle who showed up in a suit and tie and led the tour to that. And I always thought of Kyle as the reason why we have to keep returning to these murals. We have to keep understanding what is the lived experience of students for these works, as we heard from Julia today. And really, what is the role of the artist in the school that's different than any other venue